G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. Here's a dangerous idea for you, well certainly a counterintuitive one. The problem for the Palestinians, the problem that Palestinians face, is not Israel. It is rather the international community's indulgence and encouragement of a Palestinian fantasy that someday they'll be able to return to Israel proper. That is the thesis of the book The War of Return, written by today's guest, who's a very prominent Israeli. She was a member of parliament in Israel. She entered the Knesset in 2010 with the Labour Party. She was a foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Shimon Peres. She left the Labour Party along with Ehud Barak. They set up an independent party, a new left-wing party called the Independence Party, a more centrist left-wing party, rather, that wanted to continue collaborating with the Netanyahu government at the time. It's all a bit internecine, as Israeli politics always is. Suffice it to say that she lost her seat in 2013 when her party no longer contested elections. She was educated at Cambridge. She was educated at Harvard. She was a political theorist and is a leading voice for the Zionist perspective. She supports a two-state solution. She does not support settlement building by Israel in the West Bank, but she does fundamentally place the core of the problem. She thinks everything else is basically window dressing around the fact that the Palestinians have never accepted that Israel has a right to exist within its own borders, and they have been indulged and encouraged by the international community to continue with that fantasy. So this is time for some real talk. Einat and I obviously disagree about a number of things here. She actually was put on my radar by a follower, a listener, a reader, so thanks to all of your feedback, because it actually does land and I do consume it. It was after I had written my piece in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age saying that it was time for Jews around the world to stop reflexively defending Israel, that a Jewish reader contacted me and said, you should expand your mind a little bit and get out of your Hamas bubble and talk to people like Einat to see what a sort of a pacifistic but robust and hawkish vision of Zionism is all about. So I hope you enjoy as much as I did. The one and only Einat Wilf. How are you doing, and how is Israel doing at the moment? Where is your head at this stage of the post-October 7th world?
Right now, I am deeply, deeply concerned on two levels, mostly, and they're coming together. The first is I fear that we might let this moment go to waste. There's a pattern that has plagued the conflict. I call it the pattern of the Jews are never allowed to win, the Arabs are never allowed to lose, and if they lose, they're definitely never allowed to acknowledge that they were defeated. And as a result, the conflict has lasted for so long, because people sometimes treat the conflict as if it's just continued because those are two crazy tribal people at it. But if you look at it, it's fueled in a way that it's incredibly logical why it continues. Because essentially, whenever the Arab side goes to a war of annihilation, and there's never been any other, they make it very clear that this is their purpose in war, to ensure that the Jews initially was to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state, after it was established to have it undone. Whenever they go to that war and they lose, rather than kind of finally getting the message that says it's enough, move on, the empires are gone, these are new states, new borders, move on. Every time they are salvaged by one power or the other that basically says, no, you haven't lost, and you don't have to come to terms with your loss. Your victory is merely delayed, so keep trying. And that's what they do. They're logical people, they keep trying. So I fear that a lot of forces are trying to ensure that even after what they did on October 7th, and I believe we're very, very far from really realizing and processing and acknowledging what they did on that day, there is a desire and a lot of pressure to go back to a time where they can end this fighting and say, look, we get to try again because we remain in control of Gaza's territory. The billions will continue to flow, and we will try again. And I really fear that we might lose this moment to finally break free from that pattern and get to the point where the Palestinians will understand that their century-long war, initially to prevent and then to undo the Jewish state, is over. That given that this was their goal and the war, they've lost, and that they can rebuild themselves as a people who want to live next to the Jewish state rather than on top of it. So I fear we might miss this moment, and that will be of great danger. I often compare it to the difference between World War I and II. It's a few months ago, I was in Paris for a conference on making peace. And I don't know, I'm sure you've seen the movie Back to the Future. And you remember there's this scene where Marty begins to understand that he's in the 50s, right? He goes into a diner, he sees a newspaper, it begins to dawn on him. So I go to this conference in Paris in their parliament about making peace. It was just a few months ago. And people are like talking about when we're going back to the negotiating table, discussing two states, we need to negotiate. And I'm sitting there and thinking, I'm in the 90s. I think I'm in the 90s. And then the moderator says, how can the EU help? And I don't know what your experience here is with European officials. They often, when they ask that in the tone of smugness of, how can we enlightened, peace-loving people help you savages solve your issues? And I told her, you know what? You know what would really help? If the EU, just for a little while, remembered how it became the EU. Because you didn't become the EU by negotiating and seeing the other side. You became the EU because some ruthless leaders of the Allies understood that World War II, unlike World War I, cannot end with a wishy-washy armistice that would allow Germany to claim that its victory had been stolen and lead a guilty Britain to appeasement. This time, it has to end with the Axis powers not just losing, unconditionally surrendering, knowing that they lost and they were defeated, paying a price for it, and from that knowledge, you can build a Germany, a Japan as new countries, and then the EU could negotiate. And I told her, that's what I want for my people. That's all I want. I want the ideology that has brought death and destruction to our region for a century. I've come to call it Palestinianism. Palestinianism has 4 core tenets. From the river to the sea. In our case, it's the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, much smaller than Australia. From the river to the sea, there will be no Jewish state. And we are therefore perpetual refugees until return. Those are the 4 core tenets of Palestinianism. And in case...
Wait, sorry, what were the 4? So from the river to the sea. Yep.
There will be no Jewish state.
Okay. Aren't those the same?
No, each one matters. Ultimately, they all amount to the same thing. But from the river to the sea, there will be no Jewish state, and we are therefore perpetual refugees until return. And
meaning the Palestinians are. That until the Palestinians can take the whole enchilada, they are refugees.
And even more, yes, and even more than taking it, until they can ensure that there are no sovereign Jews anywhere in the land, Jews who have a sense of liberty and confidence and who they are, until that shameful aberration of Jews daring to imagine themselves free and equal, until that is gone, they will maintain themselves in complete opposition to any international norm or standard as perpetual refugees until the day of return. And in case anyone ever wondered that return is maybe some soft nostalgia, October 7th is the realization of the Palestinian vision of return. I've recently published a book with my colleague Adi Schwartz. It's an updated version of the War of Return, which in many ways warned against October 7th, warned Western countries against continuing to pump money into this ideology of return. And
was the Netanyahu government culpable for facilitating that?
For facilitating what part?
The financing of Hamas, the legitimization of Hamas.
Not just him. It's not about Hamas. I wish it were only Hamas. Hamas is merely the executive arm of Palestinianism. Hamas has been the most brutal and successful executive arm of Palestinianism. But long before there was Hamas, they butchered and they hijacked and they took photographs of brutalized Jewish bodies. We bring those stories in the book going back to the 30s and 40s. Hamas is just a recent iteration.
But how do you explain more moderate incarnations of Palestinianism, like the Palestinian Authority?
There isn't. There aren't what we call moderate. Is moderate in the means. So the only difference between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas is the means by which they wish to bring about the end of the Jewish state. But there's no difference between them in terms of the goal.
No Palestinians?
For individuals. So over the last 20 years, because when I started my own personal process, I come from the Israeli left. I genuinely believed that the only thing standing between us and peace is a Palestinian state or Palestinian control of territory. I supported every Israeli prime minister that put that to the test, supported disengagement. And I lived through the process by which, faced with clear, concrete opportunities to have a sovereign state of Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza, no settlements, no occupation, capital in East Jerusalem, including holy sites, they walk away. Two different leaders, Arafat and Abu Mazen, walk away. They follow it up with murderous violence, certainly in 2001, 2, 3, 4, which were misnamed the Second Intifada, but it was no popular uprising. I'm sure you know, before October 7th, it was the darkest time to live in Israel. There was a real palpable sense that you were playing Russian roulette with your life if you just went to coffee. So suicide bombers all over Israel. And again, this was weeks and months after they could have had everything we were told they wanted. So I started to ask a simple question. Then what do they want? And I met with Palestinians, moderates from the Palestinian Authority, cream of the crop, educated in the best American and British schools. And they said to me, the Jews are not a people. You have no connection to this land. The moderates. And I came back from there realizing that the way I thought about the conflict, which is let's divide, let's share, none can have all of it. They basically said, what are you doing here? Get out. And I said to myself, maybe I met the wrong people. And I did the research that became the book, The War of Return. And in the book, I bring a quote that I've used it ever since. It's by Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II. If you know, a friend to the Jewish people, he was not. And he needs to go to the British Parliament to essentially explain British failure. Britain received trusts from the League of Nations to help Arabs and Jews achieve sovereignty on lands of the Ottoman Empire. The Arabs get their states, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, but the Jews don't have a state. So Britain failed to fulfill the terms of a trust that it unanimously received from the League of Nations. So he needs to explain the failure. He goes to the parliament and he says, His Majesty's government is faced with an irreconcilable conflict. Now it's February 47. What I love about this moment is in February 47, you have no excuses. There's no settlements. no occupation, no blockade of Gaza, no Ben Gvir Smotrich that I hear now they're the problem. There's no Bibi. There was such a time. There was even...
He's not that old.
Yes. There was even... No one is displaced. Sometimes you hear this bizarre story. The Palestinians are fighting or angry because they've been displaced. I'm like, in February 47, everyone is in place. So there's no excuses.
There had been decades of
No.
roiling backs and forths, right? I mean, there had been a lot of Jewish immigration to the Holy Lands.
Fine, and they
19th
settled
century.
on land reclaimed from malaria, but Arabs were not displaced. In February 47, everyone is in place. So, and he calls it irreconcilable, and he goes on to explain. He says the Jews and Arabs each have a top priority. No one, of course, is called a Palestinian at this point. He says the top priority for the Jews is to establish a sovereign Jewish state. So they want to exercise the principle of self-determination in their homeland. Fine. And then he goes on to say, and the Arabs, and these are not any Arabs, these are the Arabs that will later hijack the name Palestine to be known as Palestinians. He says those Arabs, their top priority, he says, and he didn't invent it, he talked to them. He says their top priority is to resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. By definition, irreconcilable. He's saying in the land, the Jews want a state, and the Arabs, as their top priority, want the Jews not to have a state. By definition, irreconcilable. Now, sometimes I describe this process as a scientific discovery. We had a hypothesis. The hypothesis was what stands between us and peace is a Palestinian state. And then comes the part that everyone likes to kind of skip over. The hypothesis was tested multiple times. Different leaders, different times, direct negotiations, unilateral retreat of territory. And in all cases, the hypothesis that what Palestinians want is a state collapses. And the Bevan hypothesis, which is that more than they want a state for themselves, their top priority is that the Jews will have nothing, explains everything.
But who's the they?
So let me
right?
just go to the they. So I go through all that and I say, maybe I met the wrong people. And I begin a journey. And I say, there must be Palestinians whose vision of peace is of living next to a Jewish state with all the implications, meaning that they have an Arab state, they're not refugees, they're living there, they have no right of return into the state of Israel. There's no such right in international law. There's no right for millions of people to settle in a state in which they were never citizens in breach of its sovereign will. There's just no such right. So I said, maybe I met the wrong people. Let me look for them. And it's been a 20-year journey where I haven't been exactly sitting at home. I've been writing and meeting and publishing and challenging, because what you're asking me is the biggest question that people have asked me over the years. They would say things like, this can't be. You're exaggerating. You have your extremists, they have their extremists, extremists on both sides. And I said, no, you don't get such an easy kind of cop-out. You think I'm wrong? The easiest thing is to disprove me. So please, go, find me a Palestinian who publicly and in their own words, because I've invented a word in the book, it's called West-planing. West-planing is, you get it.
Yeah.
West-planing is when Western diplomats, journalists, academics explain away what Palestinians, to their credit, inconveniently say.
And just to clarify, we all do this a bit, right? I mean, the way a far-right Israeli politician talks privately in Israel is different than the way that he presents himself to the European Union speaking in English.
But what's unique in the Arab world is in the Arab world, actually what's said publicly is of value. I used to serve in the Israeli intelligence. That was my military service way back in the 90s. When I got out, I said we can do something much simpler. We can close most of our intelligence agencies and do something much, much simpler. Listen to what the Arabs are telling us, because they're telling us what they're going to do. We just do this. We're just like, they don't mean it. It's bluster. The new book in Hebrew opens with 2 pages before the foreword of Sinwar, the head of Hamas, and other leaders of Hamas, before the massacre, leading to it, 2 years before, 1 year before, 6 months before, all the way a week, a day before. The day of return is near. We are returning. The campaign for return has begun. The day of return is closer than ever.
Well, of course, Sinwar would say that. He was a psychopath.
No, but he was doing it in the name of the most important Palestinian vision. And we have on October 8th many others saying, we are returning, we are returning. This is why you saw the euphoria on that day, not just all across Gaza, but in the West Bank and among kind of Palestinianists around the world. But again, I tell people, you think I'm wrong. By all means, find me a Palestinian who publicly and in their own name will say that their vision of peace is to live next to a Jewish state, not from the river to the sea, and that they understand that it means that the Arab state, they're not refugees, and there's no right of return into Israel. I've discovered over the years those are the 2 most reliable litmus tests if the vision is really of living next to a Jewish state. And I tell them, go, prove me wrong. Over 20 years, and as I said, I'm not sitting at home. I'm challenging people. I'm going out. I'm seeking those people. I have found 4 courageous individuals whose vision it is, who speak up. 4.
Well, there are plenty of diaspora Palestinians who will say it. I mean,
No.
I've had Omar Dajani on the show, who was part of the negotiating team with Mazen in the Olmert negotiations, where behind the scenes, I think they all understood. Look, they're not going to love it. They're not going to love it, right? Of course, they're not going to love it. But there are things that people will cop. There are things that people will accept and tolerate if it means that it's the only way to get a deal. It's very, very difficult for them to come out and publicly announce from a position of powerlessness after they feel that they've been shat on for so many decades and occupied. It's just not going to pass muster with the Arab street, right? To say
so
it publicly.
Listen to what you just did.
I mean, I'm not absolving it. What I'm saying is that strategically for Israel, why not take every win you can get, even if it's a private one?
But because they're not wins. What you said right now, was a legitimate view in the 90s. In the 90s, we could say, okay, this whole discussion of return and all that, this is bluster, this is negotiating position. Our understanding...
Or it may be a deeply held belief that they're willing to compromise on.
Either way, the notion that at the end of the day, they're willing to compromise on it. That was the idea. That was a legitimate view in the 90s, that this is a position about which they will ultimately compromise. And that's what I said, the thesis collapsed, because what we realized is that at the moment, because at the end of the day, how do you know what a person really wants, a collective or an individual? At the moment that they have to decide. As long as they don't have to decide, we as individuals, we can say we want A, B, C, and D. But we need to choose. Then we'll be revealed as to who we are and what we want. So that's why I said the thesis was tested. When Palestinians were facing a choice, and it's the same choice they faced in 37, 47, all the years, 2000, 2008, and many in the between, they faced a choice. You can have your own state. That's what's on the table. A state of Palestine, fully sovereign, no occupation, no settlements, was all on the table, capital in East Jerusalem, including holy sites. And every time, imagine a scale.
Well, you're talking about the Olmert plan? I mean, it's not like there was every time. I mean, there was, times are you talking about?
Well, we can begin, because at one point you have to understand they're consistent. 37, 47, 67, immediately after, 2000, 2008. At every single time, at one point you have to appreciate the consistency. They say it, they act on it, and there are 4 individual exceptions. So at one point you have to appreciate the consistency between them saying return.
Wait, what are the 4 exceptions?
Who they are?
Yeah.
So Mohammed Dajani, he's one of the people. John Aziz, very active on Twitter. I did some I did some joint panels with him. Someone who's very interesting recently is Ahmed Fouad al-Khatib. He's the first one who's actually trying to establish an organization that will finally end this whole ethos of resistance, return. He calls it out. And it's actually the first time ever that Palestinians have even an organization. It's a tiny NGO that tries to challenge Palestinianism, this ethos of return. So at one point, you need to appreciate both the historical consistency, that at every single moment when they faced a choice, and it's always been the same choice, you can have an Arab state, but it will live next to a Jewish state. Every single time they said absolutely not and went to war and went to a campaign of violence. So at one point you have to appreciate the consistency.
But where are all these offers of the Arab state? I don't understand. There was 2000 and there was 2008. 2008 was the first time really that there was a closeness, a proximity between negotiators where everybody could sort of see the shape of the actual thing that was going to happen.
No.
That offer didn't exist in...
No, the offer existed in 2000.
I mean, it existed maybe in the imagination of Israelis, but it didn't
was
exist
on the
on
table.
paper.
President Clinton made it very clear, even recently in a speech. It was on the table. Again, listen to what you're doing. Again, you say it was close, it was there. It was not close. We Israelis, Westerners, tell a story that, there was... If you look at all the papers that were published, everything that was said, the Palestinians continued to insist that there is a right of return, that it belongs to every Palestinian in perpetuity, that it is superior to Israel's sovereignty. There was nothing to show that they broke from a century of from the river to the sea, there will be no Jewish state, and we are therefore
But why do you have
refugees.
to grind them into submission rhetorically? Why can't it be enough that you say, all right, you continue with this fantasy, but in reality we're going to sign an agreement, much like the Olmert plan, which said, well, the right of return will just mean that a few hundred or a few thousand people will go to these
West planning.
places.
They didn't take it. Look again. I mean, I'm saying look at the data, look at the evidence. Every time they walk away, and you keep saying, no, but they meant, but it was close. But the evidence is they walk away. And at the end of the day, if you claim to be a movement of self-determination and liberation, there are no parallels for a movement that claims to want liberation, self-determination, that faces multiple opportunities to achieve its goals and doesn't take it. So at one point, again, you have to appreciate the consistency between the fact that they've said it for over a century, that they've acted on it, and this is not rhetorical. Again, we thought, West Planers, that it was a dream, a delusion, they can believe in it, only to realize that at the critical moment, when they face the choice, you can have a state, your own state, but it has to live next to a Jewish state, and the implication is that there's no return. Every time they walked away. So at one point, again, you have to appreciate the consistency between ideology and action, and the fact that there are no exceptions except for these 4 courageous individuals. At one point, you have to appreciate that.
I guess what I'm thinking about, Einat, is that societies and cultures are a complicated, interlocking jigsaw puzzle of many different interests and different beliefs, right? I mean, they're not monolithic necessarily.
But they're within boundaries. There are boundaries that define
right,
who's
but I just don't
out
want
of a society.
Yes, but I just don't want us to allow the most extreme voices on either side to be the ones who represent the whole, because otherwise we're hostage to them, right?
But they're not.
So suppose that let's just hypothetically imagine that there's, 10%, 15% of Palestinians who are okay with an Israeli state. Let's just suppose that maybe that's possible. Then we've got some group of people who find it really hard to say that they're okay with it, but would probably cop it if they had to, and if it meant that they were not going to live lives that, that resemble the ones that they've lived for the past half century. And then you've got the extremists who think that it would be great to just kill as many Jews as possible, and that they're not going to tolerate anything less than the Jews being out of the Middle East altogether. We have to find a way, surely, to not always have the extremists as the people who, simply by acting up, become the representatives of the whole. Like, how do we strategically sideline them rather than allowing them, giving them essentially a terrorist's veto, so that even if the 10% of willing participants plus the people who will cop it, even if you could expand that and expand that and expand that so it's 99%, you're always going to have the 1% who want to blow the whole thing up. And if we say the moment they blow it up, they represent the whole and they demolish everything, then we never inch towards progress, do we? Like, how do you split them off?
So I'll talk, it goes back to the World War I versus World War II progress. But before that, notice how many assumptions you made. I would argue many of them coming from a desire to believe something. And again, I know that because that's what I wanted to believe. But it's not extremists. We've seen again and again. You know what? The moment for me was not just that Arafat and Abu Mazen, without going back to history, this was my experience. I was so euphoric, we're going to have peace. To see them walk away, to see them especially follow it up with murderous violence. But that was not the two things that really made the difference. The most important thing is that there were no Palestinian voices in both cases. None that said, "What are you doing? Go back to the negotiating table. Get us the state we've wanted." Someone recently said, there was someone, I checked, I went through everything he said. His only argument was that was not smart to walk away, but he didn't challenge, he said, we made Clinton angry. That was it. But, sometimes people say that was then. I say, you know what, now? Olmert now published a map. He said this was the map. Now, except for Ahmed, there were no Palestinian voices, even in London or in Columbia University, who said, that was a great proposal. Why did we not say yes? So again, the fact that there were no dissenting Palestinian voices, and again, you will West Plain, you can't dissent in Palestinian society. There was plenty of dissent and criticism of Arafat, of Abu Mazen. Do you know for what? For daring to negotiate. There was no dissent when they left the negotiating room, which means that they knew they were fulfilling their people's wishes. But I'm with you. I want that society to change because I don't live in Sydney. I live in Israel, and I want to finally be free of a conflict where for a century I have an enemy that wants nothing less than my non-existence as a sovereign being. I want that to change. But the way to change is precisely to make it clear that there is no room for this ideology of Palestinianism. And we have done the Arabs of Gaza and the West Bank and living in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, we've done them no favor by constantly telling them, try again. Why is so much of my work focused on UNRWA, supposedly some fringe organization? UNRWA is...
This is the UN refugee agency.
No, it's the UN Relief and Works Agency.
Yes.
It's the temporary mechanism that was established to settle the Arab and Jewish refugees from the war. Israel settled the Jews. It was hijacked by the Arab refugees to become essentially the means by which they funnel Western money, UN legitimacy to keep the war going. And what UNRWA does is constantly help them legitimize that the war is not over. Tens of millions of people became refugees at the same time. Empires collapsed, new states were established, new borders were established. All of them got the message. Hindus and Muslims and Germans and Poles and Ukrainians and Bulgarians and Greeks and Turks and Jews. All of them got the message. It's tough. It's tragic. Move on. Now, this is a message that creates peace. It's tough. Over the years, I've come to separate what I call feeling good and doing good. I've realized that most of the people who claim to want to do good, they just want to feel good. Because doing good requires doing things that don't feel good, such as telling tens of millions of refugees around the world, it's tough, it's tragic, move on. No right of return. Germans were displaced after they surrendered. 12, 13, 14 million of them. They wanted to go back. Did they get the message? Yes, they got the message. It's over. And they've moved on to create a peaceful nation. So the message that should have been given 100 years ago, 75 years ago, now finally is, it's over. There will be a Jewish state. Your century-long war to prevent and then to undo the Jewish state is over and you lost. Nobody wants to say you lost. Believe me, I've given this message and I was in the Norwegian parliament many years ago, before October 7th. There's a nation that just wants to feel good. They claim to want to do good. They just want to feel good. And I told them that you're very attached to your vision of yourselves as a nation of do-gooders. I was like, you really want to do good? And again, I said that before October 7th. You need to tell the Palestinians that they're in their century-long war to undo the Jewish state they've lost, and that they can move on and build prosperous, successful lives next to a Jewish state, but not from the river to the sea.
So, and at one thing...
And just I would say,
please.
This will finally allow voices that want to say something different. It will allow them to emerge, because we have done no favors by always allowing Palestinianism to persist and doing this and saying things like you said, well, you can't expect them. I'm done. They are a capable people. They are capable of expressing themselves very clearly. I want to know. It used to be understood that to make peace, the war must be over. First the war is over, then you make peace. The war against the existence of a Jewish state in any size between the river and the sea must be over, and then we can make peace.
What you're talking about basically is agency.
Oh, yes.
Right? And one thing that has been incredibly frustrating since October 7th is to notice how much agency the world gives Jews and how much sympathy they give to Palestinians, as if there's only one party here that is actually responsible for their actions and responsible for the situation. And we do this all the time, right? You know, it reveals our biases if you look at who someone gives sort of a condescending sense of sympathy to and who someone gives agency to. This maps back onto that template that we were talking about earlier about the oppressor and the oppressed. The oppressor has all the agency. The oppressed gets all of our sympathy. So I share a lot of your instinct about how out of kilter that is, and your desire to shift agency back to Palestinians and say that it is not all Israel's fault. And at the same time, we have to take responsibility for creating a climate in which their agency is able to flourish in ways that are productive and constructive rather than dysfunctional, right? So their civic societies, their capacity to articulate themselves and to see a vision for themselves has to be fostered and nurtured and tended in some way. And it strikes me as ungenerous to stand astride an occupation and settlements and a blockade and say, you're not doing a good enough job of articulating publicly your love for us, when the conditions for them to do so are inimical.
Again, this is why I bring the quote from February 47, because everyone likes to go to the excuses and I like to go to the core. They have agency now. They've always had it. Let's agree that October 7th required years of strategic planning, discipline, financial and economic planning, vision, a perverted vision, but vision. These are not an incapable people. They have agency, they have capabilities, they made a choice.
Right, but so what's their alternative choice? They come up and they say Israel has a right to exist and we want a state. What do you think Netanyahu says if Gazans come up and say we want a Palestinian state in peace with Israel?
That moment they get a state, and I'll explain why. The Jews, for the last century...
Netanyahu pulls the settlements out of the West Bank?
I'll explain why this is not personal. Everyone likes to personalize. It's not. The Jews, for the last century, have always agreed to every two-state solution, provided that one of the two is the Jewish state. And the Arabs have always rejected a two-state solution if one of the two is the Jewish state. Why is that? It's not individual, it's not personal, it's numbers. At the end of the day, the Jews are a tiny, and I'll add tiny, linguistic, religious, national, ethnic minority in an Arab and Islamic Middle East. They will never get out of that. We can make lots of babies, and we do. People come and immigrate to Israel. Jews come. That's wonderful. I always like to tell people that in 1948, the ratio of Jews to Arabs was 1:50. So we wanted to get out of that sense of being a minority, and we had Jews immigrate, and we're a very fertile nation.
Had as much sex as you possibly
could. Exactly. And the ratio today is 1:60. So they've been busy too. There is nothing that gets us out of our minority status in the region. Now, as a result, this means that the Jews were always willing to compromise. I don't believe in individuals. I don't believe in that kind of, it's all him. At the end of the day, what matters, there's no kind of, we're nice, they're not. It's numbers. We're small, so we're willing to compromise. You know, someone once told me, Einat, he was getting very angry with my insistence. I was like, Einat, is there anything that will lead you to say that Israel's the reason we don't have peace? And I would say, yes, if we had 1 billion Jews. I was like, we are globally 15 million, in the land 7 million. We, except for our desire for sovereignty, are not the problem here. You know, in the new book, I bring a wonderful quote from a colleague of mine, Oren Kessler. He wrote a beautiful book called Palestine 1936 about the Great Arab Revolt. And it's a conversation between the Arab mayor of Jerusalem in the early 20th century and a Zionist activist. And he tells him, look, Jews can come. That's nice. Jews are great. They can contribute. But Jews are like salt in a bread. A little bit is nice, but if there's too much, better to have nothing. Again, early 20th century, he's very clear. If it's too much, better to have nothing. So the Zionist leader tells him, but we're done being the salt. We want to be bread. And in many ways, from that moment, you can understand that the conflict was inevitable because the Jews were challenging by then a 1,300-year-old established vision of what Jews are in the Arab and Islamic world as lower, humiliated, not even second class, the people you can spit on, the people you can humiliate. Those people dare imagine themselves free and equal? The violent response was almost immediate. Go back to your place. I always like to bring an example that of the many humiliations the Jews suffered in the Arab and Islamic world that were intended to make it clear that they're not the equals, not until they convert. Jews could not ride horses, it was only donkeys. Horses were a mark of dignity, and they could clearly not carry arms. They were not allowed to protect themselves. And there were many humiliations. The color yellow, they were spat on. They had to pay special taxes in a humiliating ceremony. Now, if you look at the early Zionist images from the early 20th century, what are some of the things you immediately see? The Jews are riding horses. they're carrying arms. They want to defend themselves by themselves. The civilizational shock of Jews assuming that position of free, equal, imagining themselves self-determined, that remains the challenge. People talk today about the Nakba, the disaster. I always like to tell people, the Arab nationalist Constantine Zurek, who coined the term the Nakba in real time in 1948, you know how he described it? Not the way that it's described today as this kind of innocent bystanders, victims. He said 7 Arab armies attempted to subdue Zionism, the language matters, essentially take the Jews back to their place, and returned on their heels impotent. And the word matters, the sense of impotence, the shame. In real time, the Nakba was the name for the shameful failure to defeat the lowly Jews. They, the people we spat on, they're the ones that are establishing a state and are defeating 7 Arab armies that attempted to subdue them. This is the issue here. This is at the core. So that's what we need to understand. So you keep asking me why I insist, because that's the core issue. The vision of peace that I promote is that when Palestinianism as an ideology is finally defeated, it could be replaced by a constructive ideology that I've come to call Arab Zionism. Now, it might sound crazy, and I say that one day it won't, but Arab Zionism is merely the Arab and Islamic embrace that the Jews are an indigenous people in the land. And in parentheses, by the way, indigenous doesn't mean that you've just lived in a place for a long time. It means that your entire culture, calendar, the way you mark time. There's a great new book by Ben Freeman, The Jews and Indigenous People, really about the way that the entire cultural language is connected to a land. It merely means that Arabs and Muslims, from their own texts and histories, embrace that Israel is merely the modern political expression of the historic indigenous connection between the people of Israel and the land of Israel. And once you have that, then all political solutions are possible. And the Jews will always agree because we're a small people and it doesn't matter who is the leader at a very single moment. This is why in the 90s, when there was the spirit of making peace, we kept electing prime ministers to make peace because we wanted to take hold of that opportunity. But our one non-negotiable was that at the end, there will be a Jewish state, a small one, but there will be a Jewish state. That was our one non-negotiable. And unfortunately, still, the Palestinianist one non-negotiable is that the Jews will not have a state. That's why it has to be over, not because I just want it.
I mean, so take the way that you're framing this about the hypothesis. I kind of like that. I like that framing, that here's a hypothesis about what Palestinians believe, and the West-splainers have to reckon with the fact that every opportunity that the Palestinians have had to express, to contradict the hypothesis, has actually reinforced the hypothesis that they don't want an Israeli state. So let's now just use that model from the Palestinian perspective and say, here's a hypothesis, and my Palestinian hypothesis is that Israel talks a big game about wanting a Palestinian state, but in actual fact, Israel wants the whole territory. So we've got these negotiations in the 90s, but let's start the clock maybe, over the past 20 years.
No, start the clock in 37, whenever.
Okay, but, let's just talk for the sake of, as a hypothetical.
No, but you want.
G'day, humans! Well, if you've listened to this much of the episode, then you must enjoy it, presumably, unless you're just listening for masochistic reasons. So you should listen to the rest of it. And the way you do that is by subscribing to the premium feed, where you not only get to hear the rest of this delightful conversation, and trust me, it gets better than what you just heard, but you also get to hear no ads, 0 ads. And previously, up until now, you had to go to the old Substack to do that and follow me on Substack and add one more platform to your life if you're not already on Substack. But here's the thing. We are now on Apple Premium Podcast as well. So with one click, Apple will just subscribe you up to the premium feed. You'll be able to listen to the rest of this conversation right now. So open up your Apple Podcasts, click the old Pay Old Zepsy button. That's probably what it's called, Pay Old Zepsy. And you click the button, and then you no longer have to be a free rider. You can feel like you're contributing to the mission of this show, which is really what we're all here for: better conversations, a freer, more freewheeling attitude towards the things that we can talk about, a way to steel-man our opponents and to take the most gracious approach towards disagreement. That is what you're voting for when you vote for Uncomfortable Conversations by going into your Apple Podcasts and clicking subscribe. I love you. If you don't do that, that's fine. I'll see you the next free episode, I guess. Take care.